In a drought-ravaged village, Ebele, born with both male and female traits, is branded a curse and marked for sacrifice. Desperate for answers, she uncovers a long-forgotten prophecy that names her as the only one who can save her people. As tensions rise and time runs out, Ebele must confront her destiny and make an unthinkable choice. Will her sacrifice bring redemption, or reveal a truth the village is not ready to face? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're tuning in from, and if you find it compelling, don't forget to hit subscribe. The once prosperous village of Ebele lay silent under a punishing sun. The cracked earth, once vibrant with green crops, stretched endlessly, a grim reminder of the drought that had gripped the land for 2 years. Rivers dried to dusty trails, livestock dwindled to skeletal frames, and the people grew restless and fearful. The elders whispered of curses, and all eyes turned to one person, Ebele. Ebele lived on the outskirts of the village in a small, dilapidated hut. Born with both male and female traits, her existence had always been a subject of whispers and superstitions. As a child, she was both pitied and feared, her uniqueness interpreted as a bad omen by the elders. Now, with the drought tightening its grip on the village, their pity had turned to hostility. The villagers blamed Ebele for their misfortune. The gods are angry because of her. They hissed as she passed through the market, her head bowed to avoid their glares. Her condition is unnatural. She's cursed us all. Ebele bore the accusations in silence, though her heart felt heavy with shame and confusion. She didn't understand why she had been born this way or why the gods would punish her for something beyond her control. Most days, she stayed in her hut, avoiding the villagers altogether, but today she had no choice. The last of her food was gone, and hunger gnawed at her insides. As she approached the market, Ebele's presence rippled through the crowd like a wave. Women clutched their children, and men turned their backs, muttering prayers under their breath. She kept her head down, her steps quick, but the weight of their judgment was impossible to ignore. At the center of the village, the elders sat beneath the baobab tree, their faces grim. Their leader, Elder Nnamdi, leaned on his staff, his eyes scanning the crowd. He had called an emergency gathering to address the worsening drought, and the people had come in droves, desperate for answers. "We cannot survive much longer," Elder Nnamdi said, his voice heavy with age and authority. "The gods demand a sacrifice to end this curse." A murmur swept through the crowd. Some nodded in agreement, while others exchanged uneasy glances. "We all know who is to blame," another elder added, his gaze fixed on Ebele, who stood at the edge of the gathering. Ebele froze as hundreds of eyes turned toward her. Her heart pounded in her chest, but she forced herself to meet their stares. She had grown used to their disdain, but the intensity of their hatred today was like a physical blow. "The gods will not bless us while she remains among us," Elder Nnamdi continued. "If rain does not come within 7 days, she must be sacrificed." A gasp rippled through the crowd, but no one protested. Even those who pitied Ebele stayed silent, unwilling to defy the elders. Ebele's legs felt like lead as she stumbled away from the gathering. Her mind raced, trying to make sense of what she had just heard. They wanted to sacrifice her? The thought was both terrifying and bewildering. How could her life or death affect the rain? Back in her hut, Ebele collapsed onto her straw mat, tears streaming down her face. She had always known she was different, but she had never imagined her existence could bring about such hatred and fear. She thought of her late mother, who had always told her she was special, a gift from the gods. But now, it seemed the gods themselves had turned against her. For hours, Ebele sat in silence, the elders' words echoing in her mind. Finally, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the sky in shades of red and gold, she made a decision. If she was truly cursed, she needed to understand why. If she was to face sacrifice, she needed to know her purpose. She wiped her tears and lit the small clay lamp in her hut. Its flickering light cast shadows on the walls, illuminating the simple carvings her mother had left behind, symbols of the village's ancient traditions. One carving caught her eye, a figure standing between two worlds, its form neither male nor female but both. Something about it stirred a memory, a story her mother had once told her about a prophecy. Ebele's breath caught in her throat. Could her mother have known something? Could she be more than just a scapegoat for the village's misfortune? The thought gave her a sliver of hope, and for the first time in years, she felt a flicker of purpose. As the village slept, Ebele resolved to find answers. If she was to survive the next 7 days, she would need to uncover the truth about herself and the drought that plagued her people. Ebele rose before dawn, the weight of the village's ultimatum pressing on her chest. The faint light of the early morning cast long shadows across her modest hut, but her resolve was firm. She could not wait for the elders' judgment to seal her fate. If there was even a chance that her condition had a meaning beyond the curses they whispered, she had to find it. Her mother's stories echoed in her mind. She remembered one in particular, about a hidden knowledge passed down by the ancestors. It was said that the old shaman, Nkiru, had been the keeper of the village's deepest secrets before she vanished years ago, retreating into the forest after being dismissed as a madwoman. If anyone could help, it was her. With trembling hands, Ebele packed a small bundle of food and water. She knew the forest was dangerous, but the thought of staying in the village, awaiting her doom, was far worse. Steeling herself, she slipped out of her hut and headed toward the dense grove on the outskirts of Abanagu. The forest loomed before her, its towering trees casting an eerie darkness over the narrow path. The air was thick with the scent of earth and damp leaves, and the sounds of chirping insects and distant animal calls surrounded her. Ebele's heart pounded with every step, but she pressed on, her determination outweighing her fear. After what felt like hours, she came upon a small clearing. In the center stood a crooked hut, its roof sagging under the weight of creeping vines. Smoke curled lazily from a chimney, and a faint hum of a song drifted from within. Ebele hesitated, her hand hovering over the door. What if Nkiru refused to help her, or worse, confirmed the village's fears that she was cursed? Before she could knock, the door creaked open. An elderly woman with sharp, piercing eyes and long, silver braids stared back at her. "I've been expecting you, child," Nkiru said, her voice raspy but warm. "Come in." Ebele stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the dim light. The hut was cluttered with dried herbs, animal bones, and carved symbols, similar to those on her own walls. It smelled of smoke and something earthy, like roots freshly pulled from the ground. "You carry a heavy burden," Nkiru said, motioning for Ebele to sit on a mat by the fire. "Tell me why you've come." Ebele hesitated, then poured out her story, the drought, the accusations, the elders' ultimatum. As she spoke, her voice wavered, but Nkiru listened intently, her expression unreadable. When Ebele finished, the old woman leaned back, her gaze thoughtful. "You are not cursed, Ebele," Nkiru said at last. "But the village does not understand what you are. They fear what they cannot explain." "What am I then?" Ebele asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nkiru stood and shuffled to a shelf, pulling down an ancient scroll. She unrolled it carefully, revealing faded illustrations of figures like the one Ebele had seen carved on her wall, beings that straddled two worlds, neither one nor the other, but both. "The ancestors spoke of a child of duality," Nkiru began, "born to bridge the gap between the mortal and spiritual realms. Your condition is not a mistake, it is a gift." Ebele's breath caught. "A gift? How can this be a gift when it's brought me nothing but pain?" "The villagers have forgotten their connection to the spirits," Nkiru said. "Their neglect of the sacred grove, their greed, and their fear have angered the gods. The drought is not your doing, but you are the key to ending it." "How?" Ebele asked, her voice tinged with desperation. "You must journey to the sacred grove and commune with the spirits," Nkiru said. "They will guide you. But know this, the path will not be easy, and the spirits will demand a great sacrifice." Ebele's mind raced. She had always felt different, but to be told she was destined for something greater was overwhelming. "Why me?" she asked. "Because only someone who exists between worlds can mend the rift," Nkiru said simply. "You are both and neither, mortal and divine. That is your power." Ebele left the hut with a mix of fear and determination. The forest seemed darker now, the path ahead uncertain, but she clung to Nkiru's words. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for herself but for the village. If she could reach the sacred grove and prove her worth, perhaps she could change their minds. As she stepped back into the light of day, the sun rising on the horizon, Ebele resolved to find the sacred grove. The clock was ticking, and the fate of the village and her own life hung in the balance. The forest grew denser as Ebele ventured deeper, the air heavy with humidity and the mingled sense of damp earth and decaying leaves. Nkiru's words echoed in her mind, urging her forward despite her growing fear. The path to the sacred grove was unmarked, a labyrinth of tangled roots and low-hanging branches that seemed to close in around her. Hours passed, and the silence of the forest deepened, broken only by the rustle of leaves underfoot and the distant calls of unseen creatures. Ebele's legs ached, and her water was nearly gone, but she pressed on, guided by an inexplicable pull in her chest, as though the grove itself was calling to her. At last, she stumbled into a clearing. The sacred grove lay before her, a hidden sanctuary untouched by the withering drought that plagued the rest of the land. Towering trees with emerald leaves formed a natural canopy, their roots twisting together like an ancient dance. In the center of the grove stood a massive baobab tree, its trunk etched with glowing symbols that pulsed faintly in the dim light. Ebele hesitated, her breath catching at the sheer otherworldliness of the place. The grove felt alive, the air thrumming with an energy that made her skin tingle. For a moment, she forgot her fear, overwhelmed by the beauty and power of the sacred space. She approached the baobab tree cautiously, her steps slow and deliberate. As she neared it, a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each step. The symbols on the tree's bark glowed brighter, casting the grove in an ethereal light. Ebele reached out, her hand trembling, and touched the trunk. The hum became a roar, and the world around her dissolved. Ebele found herself standing in a vast, mist-filled expanse. Shadows moved at the edges of her vision, their forms shifting and indistinct. A voice, deep and resonant, echoed through the void. "Child of duality, why have you come?" "I seek answers," Ebele said, her voice shaking but resolute. "The village blames me for the drought, but Nkiru told me the truth. She said you were angry with them. I need to know how I can make things right." The shadows coalesced into shapes, figures that mirrored the carvings on her mother's walls and the scroll in Nkiru's hut. They surrounded her, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. "You are not the cause of the drought," the voice said. "But the village's actions have disrupted the balance. They abandoned the sacred grove, disrespected the land, and neglected their bond with us. For this, they suffer." Ebele's heart sank. "Then what am I to do? How can I restore the balance?" "You are the bridge," the voice replied. "You alone can mend the rift. But balance demands sacrifice." "What kind of sacrifice?" Ebele asked, dread creeping into her voice. The figures did not answer directly. Instead, they showed her a vision, a grove restored, the villagers bowing in reverence as rain poured from the sky. At the center of it all stood Ebele, her form glowing with the same light that illuminated the symbols on the baobab tree. The vision shifted, and she saw herself fading into the light, her body dissolving as the rain fell. "You must choose," the voice said. "Will you embrace your destiny, or will you let the village perish?" Ebele's throat tightened. She had come seeking answers, but the weight of what was being asked of her was almost too much to bear. She thought of her mother's words, of the villagers' hatred, and of the prophecy that had haunted her since she first heard it. Her heart ached with fear and longing. Could she truly give everything for the people who had rejected her? The vision faded, and Ebele found herself back in the grove. The glow of the symbols had dimmed, and the hum was now a soft whisper. She leaned against the baobab tree, her mind reeling. The spirit's demands were clear. If the village was to survive, she would have to sacrifice herself. But even in her despair, she felt a spark of determination. She could not give up now. The spirits had entrusted her with this task, and she would see it through, no matter the cost. As she left the grove, the tree seemed to part for her, the path ahead illuminated by slivers of sunlight breaking through the canopy. The ticking clock of the village's ultimatum echoed in her mind, urging her onward. She had the answers she sought, but the hardest part was yet to come. Ebele returned to the village just as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows over the cracked earth and barren fields. The sight of her made the villagers pause in their evening routines, their eyes narrowing with suspicion. Mothers pulled their children closer, and men muttered prayers under their breath, as though her presence alone might summon misfortune. Ebele ignored their stares and walked straight to the elders gathering under the baobab tree. Her steps were steady, but her heart raced. The truth she carried was heavy, and she knew convincing the village to accept it would be her greatest challenge yet. The elders turned to her as she approached, their expressions a mixture of anger and weariness. Elder Namdi, his gnarled staff planted firmly in the ground, was the first to speak. "Why have you returned, Ebele? We have already spoken of your fate." "I have been to the sacred grove," Ebele said, her voice steady despite the lump in her throat. "I spoke to the spirits. The drought is not my doing, but yours." Gasps rippled through the gathered villagers, and a murmur of disbelief spread. Elder Namdi's eyes narrowed. "Blasphemy," he said. "You dare accuse us?" "I dare to speak the truth," Ebele shot back. "The spirits are angry because you abandoned the sacred grove and forgot your bond with the land. They demand atonement, not my death." The crowd erupted into chaos. Some shouted accusations, while others whispered among themselves, uncertain. A few stepped forward to defend her, their voices drowned out by the uproar. Ebele stood her ground, her eyes locked on Elder Namdi. "You expect us to believe this?" the elder said, his voice rising above the din, "that the spirits would choose you, a cursed child, to speak for them?" "I am not cursed," Ebele said firmly. "I am the bridge. That is why I was born this way, to mend the rift between our world and theirs. The spirits have given us a chance to make things right, but we must act now." Despite her conviction, the crowd remained divided. Some, desperate for rain and salvation, pleaded with the elders to heed Ebele's words. Others clung to their fear and hatred, unwilling to believe she could be anything but a curse. In the midst of the chaos, an unexpected voice rose. "She speaks the truth." The villagers turned to see Elder Ozioma, the oldest of the council, stepping forward. Her frail frame shook as she leaned on her cane, but her voice was strong. "For years, we ignored the signs," Elder Ozioma continued. "The withering of the grove, the drought, the strange dreams some of us have had. We dismissed them because we were too afraid to face the truth. But Ebele has done what none of us dared. She sought the spirit's wisdom. We cannot ignore her." A hush fell over the crowd. Elder Namdi scowled but did not interrupt. Ebele's heart swelled with gratitude for Ozioma's support, but her relief was short-lived. "I knew of the prophecy," another voice admitted, breaking the silence. It was Elder Chima, his face pale and drawn. "I knew that one day a child of duality would come to save us, but I said nothing. I was afraid of what it would mean, afraid of change. When Ebele was born, I convinced myself she could not be the one." The crowd erupted again, this time with anger. Villagers accused Chima of betrayal, blaming him for the suffering they had endured. Others looked to Ebele with new respect, as if seeing her for the first time. Ebele raised her hands, her voice cutting through the noise. "The blame does not matter now. What matters is what we do next. The spirits demand that we restore the sacred grove and atone for our neglect. If we fail, the drought will continue and we will all perish." Despite her plea, the villagers remained divided. Some, led by Elder Namdi, refused to believe her, insisting that her death was the only way to appease the gods. Others, swayed by Elder Ozioma and the weight of Chima's confession, agreed to help her restore the grove. The village fractured that night, factions forming as arguments spilled into the streets. Ebele returned to her hut, exhausted and uncertain. She had hoped the truth would unite them, but it had only deepened their divisions. As she lay on her mat, staring at the flickering shadows on the wall, Ebele knew the final battle was yet to come. The spirits had warned her that balance required sacrifice, and she feared the ultimate cost would be hers to bear. Still, she resolved to see it through. If she could save the village, even those who hated her, it would be worth it. The sun rose slowly over Abanagu, casting a golden hue over the dry, cracked land. Despite the early hour, the village was alive with activity. The two factions had come to a boiling point. On one side stood those who believed in Ebele's words, busy preparing offerings to help restore the sacred grove. On the other side, led by Elder Namdi, villagers sharpened their tools, insisting Ebele's death was the only way to end the drought. Ebele stood in the center of it all, her heart heavy but resolute. She had tried to unite the village, to make them see reason, but the rift was too deep. As arguments flared around her, she realized the time for words had passed. If she was to fulfill her role as the bridge between worlds, she would have to act decisively and alone. As the sun climbed higher, Ebele walked to the sacred grove. Those who believed her followed at a distance, their faces filled with a mix of hope and fear. Even some of the doubters trailed behind, drawn by curiosity or desperation. Elder Namdi and his faction stayed behind, their anger festering in whispers. The grove was more alive than ever, the air humming with unseen energy. The baobab tree glowed faintly in the dappled sunlight, its carved symbols pulsing with an otherworldly rhythm. Ebele approached it with slow, deliberate steps, her heart pounding in her chest. She turned to face the crowd gathered at the grove's edge. "The spirits demand balance," she said, her voice strong despite the lump in her throat. "And balance requires sacrifice. I am ready to give what is needed." "No," cried Elder Ozioma, stepping forward. "You've done enough, child. There must be another way." Ebele shook her head. "The spirits chose me for this. If I am to save the village, it must be through me." Kneeling before the baobab tree, Ebele placed her hands on its glowing trunk. The symbols flared to life, bathing the grove in a radiant light. The villagers gasped, many dropping to their knees in awe. The hum grew louder, rising to a deafening crescendo as the ground beneath them began to tremble. The spirits' voices echoed around her, their words filling her mind. "Child of duality, are you prepared to give yourself for the balance?" Ebele's voice wavered, but her resolve did not. "Yes," she said, her words carrying across the grove. "I give myself freely." The light from the tree surged, enveloping Ebele in a blinding glow. The villagers shielded their eyes, their cries of fear and wonder mingling in the air. For a moment, it seemed as though Ebele would vanish entirely, her form dissolving into the radiant energy. But then, as suddenly as it began, the light dimmed. When the villagers opened their eyes, Ebele stood before them, transformed. Her once ordinary form now glowed faintly, her features serene and otherworldly. The drought's weariness had left her. She looked both human and divine, a true embodiment of the bridge between worlds. The first raindrop fell. It splashed onto the dry earth, darkening the cracked ground. Another followed, then another, until the heavens opened in a torrential downpour. The villagers cried out in joy, their hands raised to the sky as the rain soaked them. The parched land drank deeply, the air filled with the scent of renewal. Ebele turned to face the villagers, her voice carrying above the sound of the rain. "The spirits have forgiven you," she said. "But the balance must be maintained. You must restore the sacred grove and honor the bond with the land. If you do not, the drought will return." Elder Namdi, drenched and humbled, stepped forward, his head bowed. "We will do as you ask," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have shown us the error of our ways. Forgive us, Ebele." Ebele nodded, though her expression was solemn. "Forgiveness is not mine to give," she said. "Only the spirits can grant it. What matters now is what you choose to do." The villagers worked together that day, clearing the grove of debris and planting new trees. Ebele watched from the edge of the grove, her heart swelling with a mix of pride and sorrow. Though she had saved the village, she knew her journey was far from over. The spirit's light still glowed faintly within her, a reminder of the bond she had forged. She was no longer just Ebele, the cursed child. She was the bridge. As the rain continued to fall, washing away the dust and doubt, Ebele turned her face to the sky. For the first time in years, she felt truly at peace.